The crystal towers of New Haven gleamed under the pale blue light of Kepler 442b's twin suns, their surfaces reflecting the peaceful morning sky like mirrors made of diamond. Administrator Veltar stood at the observation deck of the central spire, his tall frame draped in flowing white robes that caught the gentle breeze. His crystalline eyes, large and multifaceted like precious gems, watched the horizon with growing concern. The Zentari had built New Haven as a testament to their peaceful nature. Every structure curved gracefully toward the sky, designed to work in harmony with the planet's natural beauty. Gardens of luminescent flowers bloomed between the buildings, their soft glow creating patterns of light that danced across the crystal walls. The colony housed nearly 50,000 Zentari, all living in perfect balance with their adopted world. But today, something was wrong. The morning air carried a sound that had never been heard on New Haven before, a low, rhythmic chittering that seemed to come from everywhere at once. Veltar's aide, a young Zentari named Colvin, approached with visible distress written across his delicate features. Administrator, the perimeter sensors are detecting massive movement in the Eastern Canyon systems, Colvin reported, his voice barely above a whisper. The readings are unlike anything in our databases. Veltar activated the colony's long-range sensors with a thought, his consciousness briefly merging with the crystalline network that connected all Zentari technology. What he saw made his blood run cold. The Eastern Canyons were alive with movement. Thousands upon thousands of dark shapes flowing like a black tide toward New Haven. "Vex swarm," he breathed, the words carrying the weight of a death sentence. The Vex were nightmare creatures that had haunted the galaxy for generations. They moved like a plague across space, consuming entire worlds and leaving nothing but barren rock in their wake. Their bodies were chitinous and black, with razor-sharp claws and mandibles that could tear through steel. They felt no pain, showed no mercy, and fought with the single-minded purpose of destruction. Veltar had heard the stories from other worlds, how the Vex would descend from the sky in their organic ships, how they would swarm across the surface like insects, how they would devour everything in their path. No military force had ever successfully defended against a full Vex assault. The best anyone could hope for was evacuation before the swarm arrived. "Activate all defensive systems," Veltar ordered, though he knew it was likely futile. "Raise the energy shields to maximum strength. Send evacuation orders to all outer settlements." The colony's crystal spires began to hum with power as the defensive grid came online. Translucent barriers of pure energy rose from the ground, forming a protective dome over the entire settlement. The shields were powerful enough to withstand natural disasters and meteor impacts, but they had never been tested against the Vex assault. As the hours passed, the chittering grew louder. The Vex poured out of the canyons like a living shadow, their black forms covering the landscape as far as the eye could see. They moved with horrifying coordination, each creature perfectly synchronized with the others in their swarm. There were hundreds of different types: small scouts with wings like torn leather, massive warriors with armor-plated carapaces, and towering queens that directed the horde with pheromone commands. The first wave crashed against the energy shields. Just as the twin suns reached their zenith, the barriers flared with brilliant light as thousands of Vex threw themselves against the protective dome. The colony's power system strained under the assault, crystal matrices glowing white-hot as they channeled enormous amounts of energy into the defensive grid. Veltar watched in horror as the Vex began to adapt their tactics. The smaller scouts searched for weak points in the shield matrix, while the warriors maintained constant pressure on the main barriers. The queens remained back from the initial assault, their massive forms pulsing with bioluminescent patterns as they coordinated their forces. "Administrator, the shields are holding, but power consumption is at 90% capacity," Colvin reported, his voice tight with fear. "At this rate, we have perhaps 6 hours before complete failure." Veltar closed his eyes and reached out. Through the Galactic communication network, his consciousness traveling faster than light across the vast distances between stars, The Galactic Defense Council's emergency channel crackled with dozens of distress calls from worlds under attack. The Vex had launched simultaneous assaults across multiple sectors, stretching the galaxy's defensive forces beyond their limits. This is Administrator Veltar of New Haven Colony on Kepler 442b, he broadcast to any who would listen. We are under attack by a massive Vex force. Our defensive shields are failing. We request immediate military assistance from any available forces. Time is critical. The response came back within minutes, a series of regretful denials from species across the galaxy. The Altarian fleet was engaged in their own sector. The Rugelian battle groups were 3 days away at maximum speed. The Arcturian defense forces were already committed to protecting their homeworld. One by one, every major military power in the galaxy explained why they could not help. "There is one possibility," came a voice from the council chambers on Alpha Centauri. "We have received acknowledgement from a small human vessel in the Outer Rim. They are only 2 hours away at their current speed." Veltar felt a mixture of hope and confusion. He had heard of humans, a newly discovered species from a world called Earth. They had only recently joined the galactic community and were still considered primitive by most standards. Their technology was crude, their ships small, and their military experience limited to conflicts on their own world. "How many ships?" Veltar asked. "One," came the reply. "A small exploration vessel with a crew of five beings. 5 individuals against a swarm of hundreds of thousands." It seemed almost insulting to suggest that such a tiny force could make any difference. But as another wave of Vex crashed against the failing shields, Veltar realized he had no choice. "Tell them we accept," he said quietly. "And may the cosmos have mercy on their souls." The shield matrix flickered as another section overloaded. In the distance, the Vex continued. Their relentless assault, their chittering cries growing louder as they sensed victory approaching. New Haven's crystal spires dimmed as power was diverted to the defensive grid, and 50,000 Zentari prepared for what might be their final hours. Help was coming, but it wore the form of 5 unknown beings from a world no one had ever heard. As Veltar watched the approaching darkness, he wondered if their would-be saviors understood what they were flying into, or if they simply didn't care. The Terra Nova dropped out of hyperspace above Kepler 442b like a falling star, its hull scarred from countless journeys through the void. Captain Jake Morrison stood on the bridge, his weathered hands gripping the command console as he studied the tactical display. The small human vessel was barely 200 meters long, dwarfed by the massive Vex bioships that hung in orbit like diseased moons. "Jesus Christ," Lieutenant Amy Rodriguez whispered from her position at the tactical station. Her dark eyes tracked the enemy formations as they pulsed with alien life. "There must be 50 of those things up there." Morrison nodded grimly. The Vex bioships were grotesque amalgamations of flesh and chitin, their surfaces crawling with smaller organisms that served as fighters and repair units. Each ship was the size of a city, capable of carrying millions of Vex warriors to the surface below. "Take us down to the colony," Morrison ordered, "and try to avoid those things if you can." Chief Engineer Mike Sullivan worked frantically at his console, rerouting power to the shields as Vex fighters began to swarm toward their position. The human ship dove toward the planet's surface, weaving between streams of bioplasma that lit up the darkness like deadly fireworks. Colonies. "About 10 clicks ahead," Rodriguez reported. "I'm reading massive energy signatures from their defensive grid." Through the view screen they could see New Haven spread out below them like a jewel in the desert. The crystal spires rose from the surface in elegant curves, their translucent walls pulsing with stored energy. Around the colony, a shimmering dome of pure force held back an ocean of darkness. The Vex swarm pressed against the barriers like a living tide. "Holy shit," Sergeant Pete Johnson muttered as he joined them on the bridge. The Marine was a compact man with scars across his knuckles and a face that had seen too many battles. "How many of those things are there?" "Conservative estimate puts it at about 200,000, Dr. Lisa Park said from her science station. She pushed her glasses up her nose as she studied the sensor readings. They're exhibiting classic swarm behavior patterns, coordinated assault with adaptive tactics. Morrison activated the communications array and opened a channel to the colony. New Haven, this is Captain Morrison of the Terra Nova. We're here to help. The response came immediately, translated by the ship's universal language matrix. The voice was musical and refined, carrying the weight of desperate hope. Captain Morrison, this is Administrator Veltar. We are grateful for your arrival, but I must inform you that our situation is critical. Our defensive shields are failing, and we estimate complete collapse within 2 hours. Morrison guided his ship through the upper atmosphere, dodging Vex fighters as they descended toward the colony. The energy dome flickered and sparked as millions of creatures threw themselves against its surface. The sight was both terrifying and mesmerizing, a perfect example of organized destruction. Requesting permission to land within your defensive perimeter, Morrison said into the com. Granted, Captain. Landing pad 7 is clear. The Terra Nova touched down on a crystalline platform near the colony's center. Morrison gathered his crew in the main airlock, checking their equipment one final time. They wore simple combat armor and carried kinetic weapons that would have seemed primitive to most galactic species. Remember, we're here to help, Morrison said to his team. These people are scared and desperate. Let's not make it worse. The airlock cycled open, revealing a delegation of Zentari waiting on the landing pad. Veltar stood at the front of the group, his tall frame draped in robes that seemed to shift color in the strange light. His large eyes widened as he took in the appearance of the humans. Captain Morrison, Veltar said, his voice carrying a note of barely concealed shock. You are most welcome to New Haven. Morrison stepped forward and extended his hand in the universal human gesture of greeting. Veltar stared at the offered hand for a moment before tentatively reaching out with his own elongated fingers. The contact was brief but formal. Thank you for accepting our call for aid, Veltar continued. Though I must confess we expected a larger force. This is it, Morrison said simply. 5 of us. The Zentari delegation exchanged glances that spoke volumes about their growing despair. Veltar's aide, Colvin, whispered something in their native language that the translator didn't catch. The administrator nodded slowly. I do not wish to seem ungrateful, Veltar said carefully, but we face nearly 250,000 Vex warriors. How do you propose to assist us with such a small force? Rodriguez stepped forward, her tactical scanner already active and recording data about the enemy formations. We'll need a full briefing on their capabilities and weaknesses. What weapons? Have you tried against them? Weapons? Veltar looked confused. We are a peaceful people, Captain. We have defensive systems but no offensive capabilities. The Zentari have not waged war in over 1,000 years. Johnson whistled low under his breath. No weapons at all? How do you handle predators or dangerous wildlife? There are no predators. On Kepler 442b, Colvin explained. We chose this world specifically because it lacks aggressive life forms. We have never needed to defend ourselves against anything more dangerous than a storm. Dr. Park activated her portable scanner and began taking readings of the Vex forces through the energy dome. Fascinating. They're using pheromone communication for coordination. Each cast has a distinct chemical signature. Can you tell us about their biology? Morrison asked. Pain tolerance, social structure, reproductive cycles? Veltar seemed taken aback by the clinical nature of the questions. They feel no pain, as far as we know. They fight until destroyed. Their social structure is based on queens who direct the lesser castes through chemical commands. They reproduce by consuming organic matter and converting it into new warriors. What about fear responses? Johnson asked. Do they retreat when facing superior firepower? Fear? Veltar's crystalline eyes reflected confusion. The Vex do not experience fear. They are perfect biological machines designed for conquest and consumption. They have never been known to retreat from any engagement. Morrison nodded as he processed this information. Around them, the energy dome flickered more frequently as the Vex pressed their attack. The chittering of millions of creatures filled the air even through the protective barriers. We'll need access to your sensor arrays and any manufacturing facilities you have, Morrison said. Also, do you have any explosive materials or high-energy power sources we can work with? Explosives? Veltar stepped backward instinctively. We have mining charges for excavation work, but nothing designed for combat. That'll work, Sullivan said with a grin. Give me some mining charges in a few hours, and I'll show you what combat engineering looks like. As they spoke, another section of the energy dome overloaded, sending cascades of sparks across the crystalline city. The Vex pressed closer, their black forms visible through the translucent barrier like insects trapped in amber. Time to get to work, Morrison said. Quietly. The first explosion shattered the evening silence like thunder, sending a pillar of fire into the darkening sky. Veltar jumped from his position at the command center, his crystalline eyes wide with shock as he watched the display screens outside. The energy dome, a section of the Vex swarm, had simply vanished in a ball of flame and smoke. What was that? He demanded, turning to the human captain who stood calmly beside him. Morrison checked his wrist communicator with the casual air of someone discussing the weather. That would be Johnson. He's testing the mining charges. Before Veltar could respond, another explosion erupted on the opposite side of the colony. This time, the blast was followed by a chain reaction as secondary charges detonated in sequence. The carefully organized Vex formations dissolved into chaos as hundreds of creatures were torn apart by the unexpected assault. How is this possible? Colvin whispered, staring at the tactical display. They're outside the protective dome. How did your people get past the Vex? They walked, Morrison said simply. The truth was more complex than that, but not by much. 3 hours earlier, Johnson had studied the Vex attack patterns and identified something that the Zentari had missed. The creatures moved in predictable waves, following pheromone trails laid down by their scouts. Between each wave was a gap, sometimes only minutes, but long enough for a skilled soldier to slip through. Johnson had loaded himself with every explosive device the colony could provide and simply walked out into the night. He moved like a ghost between the Vex formations, using techniques learned in a dozen wars on Earth. When the creatures detected his presence, he was already gone, leaving behind carefully placed charges that would detonate hours later. This is impossible, Veltar said, watching as more explosions rippled through the enemy ranks. The Vex have perfect sensory capabilities. They can detect any life form within their perimeter. Dr. Park looked up from her portable laboratory, where she had been studying captured Vex pheromone samples. Actually, that's not entirely accurate. They can detect familiar life forms, but their system is based on chemical recognition. They've never encountered human scent before. She held up a small vial of dark liquid. I've been analyzing their communication pheromones. Each caste uses a different chemical signature to coordinate with the others. But there's something interesting. They also use scent marking to identify safe zones and hunting grounds. Meaning what? Morrison asked. Meaning we can lie to them, Park said, with a smile that would have terrified the Zentari if they had understood its implications. I've synthesized a compound that mimics their safe zone markers. Anyone carrying it will be ignored by the lower castes. On the far side of the colony, another series of explosions lit up the night. This time, the blasts were followed by something new, the sound of automatic gunfire. Rodriguez had taken position on a crystalline spire overlooking the battlefield, her rifle picking off Vex commanders with precise shots. Lieutenant Rodriguez is eliminating their command structure, Morrison explained to the stunned Zentari. Without the queens and sub-queens to coordinate them, the warrior castes become confused and disorganized. Veltar watched the tactical display with growing amazement. The Vex formations that had seemed so perfectly coordinated were beginning to break apart. Small groups of creatures wandered aimlessly while others attacked their own kind in confusion. But how can she see them in the darkness? Colvin asked. The Vex prefer to attack at night when their natural camouflage is most effective. Infrared scope, Rodriguez's voice crackled through the comm system. These things glow like Christmas trees in thermal imaging. I can see every heat signature within 2 kilometers. Sullivan's voice joined the conversation from somewhere beneath the colony. I've finished rigging the underground charges. When those bug bastards try to tunnel under the shields, they're going to get a real surprise. The Zentari had never heard language like this before. Their own communication was formal and poetic, filled with careful consideration and diplomatic phrasing. The humans spoke with a casual brutality that was both shocking and oddly reassuring. Your people use very colorful expressions, Veltar observed. Wait until you hear what Johnson says when he gets back, Morrison replied, as if summoned. By his words, Johnson's voice came through the CUM system, heavy with exhaustion but tinged with satisfaction. Phase 1 complete. I count approximately 3,000 confirmed kills and major disruption to their northern formations. Coming back in now. 3,000? Veltar's voice rose in pitch. One person eliminated 3,000 Vex warriors? Conservative estimate, Johnson's voice replied. Hard to get an accurate count when you're dealing with explosive fragmentation. Could be more. Dr. Park had moved to a new position where she could observe the Vex behavior patterns directly. The really interesting part is how they're adapting to our tactics. The Queens are trying to reorganize their forces, but they're operating from incomplete information. Explain, Morrison said. They're evolved to fight other galactic species who use energy weapons and defensive strategies they've never encountered. Kinetic projectiles, chemical explosives, or guerrilla warfare. Their biological programming has no response protocols for these situations. On the tactical display, the Vex swarm was beginning to shift its formation. The creatures pulled back from the energy dome, forming new patterns that seemed more cautious and defensive. They're learning, Veltar said with growing fear. The Vex are adapting to your tactics. Good, Morrison said, surprising everyone in the command center. That means they're afraid. Afraid? Colvin looked confused. But you said earlier that the Vex do not experience fear. They don't, Rodriguez's voice came through the CUM. But their Queens do. The biological programming that makes the worker castes fearless doesn't extend to the command structure. The Queens can feel fear, and right now they're scared as hell. Another explosion echoed across the landscape as Sullivan's underground charges detonated. A section of the Vex swarm that had been attempting to tunnel beneath the colony's defenses simply disappeared in a geyser of flame and debris. The Queens are pulling back to reassess the situation, Dr. Park reported. They're trying to understand what they're facing. This is probably the first time in their species' history that they've encountered an enemy that fights back instead of just defending. Morrison checked his weapons and equipment. That gives us maybe 6 hours before they adapt and try a new approach. We need to make those hours count. What do you intend to do? Veltar asked. Morrison's smile was the kind that had once made Earth's apex predators nervous. We're going to show them what happens when prey becomes predator. Outside the energy dome, the Vex swarm regrouped in the darkness, their chittering calls now tinged with something that sounded almost like uncertainty. For the first time in their violent history, they had encountered something that hunted them back. The Vex Queen Prime stood 8 meters tall, her chitinous body pulsing with bioluminescent patterns that spoke of rage and confusion. She had lived for 3 centuries, conquering 47 worlds, and never once had her swarm faced defeat. Now, surrounded by the scattered remains of her forward battalions, she struggled to understand what had gone wrong. Her chemical sensors detected the lingering scent of the explosives that had torn through her formations. The compounds were unlike anything in her genetic memory. Crude, primitive, but devastatingly effective. The small creatures responsible for this carnage moved with patterns that defied all logic, appearing and disappearing like phantoms in the night. Morrison crouched in the ruins of a Vex biostructure, his rifle trained on the massive Queen through. His scope. The creature's head was large enough to house a small vehicle, covered in sensory organs that twitched and turned as they searched for threats. A single shot to the right spot would eliminate the command node for thousands of warriors. Target acquired, he whispered into his CUM, taking the shot. The bullet struck the Queen Prime between her primary sensory cluster, penetrating the thin membrane that protected her brain cavity. She toppled backward with a sound like breaking glass, her massive form crushing dozens of her own warriors as she fell. The effect was immediate and catastrophic. Without their queen's pheromone guidance, the surrounding Vex warriors began to attack each other. Their perfect coordination dissolved into chaos as different castes interpreted the sudden silence as conflicting orders. "That's Queen number 7. Down," Rodriguez reported from her position atop the crystal spire. "The northern formations are in complete disarray." Dr. Park monitored the situation from her mobile laboratory, tracking the chemical signatures of the various Vex castes. "The loss of command structure is causing a cascade failure in their hierarchy. The sub-queens are fighting each other for dominance." Johnson emerged from the shadows carrying a collection of Vex scent glands he had harvested from fallen warriors. His uniform was covered in the dark ichor that served as Vex blood, and his face bore the satisfied expression of a job. "Well done? Got enough of these things to confuse their entire western flank," he announced, holding up the grotesque trophies. "Park, you ready with that synthetic pheromone?" "Already prepared," she replied, handing him several spray canisters. "This mixture should convince them that the western approach is a designated feeding ground for a rival queen." "Feeding ground?" Veltar asked, his voice filled with horror. "You mean they will attack their own kind?" "That's the idea," Johnson said with a grin that showed far too many teeth. "These things are basically biological machines programmed for aggression. Take away their coordination and they'll turn on anything that moves." Sullivan's voice crackled through the cum from deep beneath the colony. "I've finished setting up the resonance charges along the underground crystal formations. When those bugs try to tunnel again, the whole cave system is going to collapse on them." Zentari watched in fascination and terror as the humans systematically dismantled the Vex assault. Every tactic they employed was brutal, efficient, and utterly alien to the peaceful colony dwellers. The humans fought with a creativity born of desperation and a willingness to sacrifice that bordered on the insane. "How do you know so much about warfare?" Colvin asked Morrison during a brief lull in the fighting. Morrison reloaded his rifle. "With practiced ease. Earth isn't a peaceful world. We've been fighting wars for our entire history. Every human learns to fight or they don't survive." "But surely your people have evolved beyond such primitive behaviors," Veltar said hopefully. "No," Morrison replied simply. "We've just gotten better at it." The truth was more complex than that, but Morrison saw no point in explaining the intricacies of human nature to beings who had never known conflict. Humans were apex predators who had clawed their way to the top of their world's food chain through superior intelligence, adaptability, and sheer bloody-minded determination. Rodriguez's voice interrupted his thoughts. "Movement in the eastern sector. Looks like they're trying a new approach." The tactical display showed a group of Vex bioforms unlike anything they had seen before. These creatures were larger than the standard warriors, with specialized sensory organs and what appeared to be crude tools grafted onto their limbs. "Adaptation specialists," Dr. Park identified them. "They're trying to analyze our tactics and develop countermeasures." "How long before they figure us out?" Morrison asked. "Unknown. But they're learning fast. Each engagement teaches them more about our capabilities." Johnson appeared at Morrison's side, his equipment pack loaded with improvised explosives. "Want me to go say hello to those smart bugs?" "Negative. They're expecting that now." "We need a different approach." Morrison studied the tactical display, his mind working through the available options. The humans had been successful so far because they were fighting an enemy that had never encountered their tactics before. But the Vex were beginning to adapt, and adaptation was the key to their success across the galaxy. "Sullivan, how long until those resonance charges are ready?" "Give me another hour and I can bring down half the canyon system." "Rodriguez, ammunition status?" 60% remaining. "I've been conserving shots, but these things don't stay dead unless you hit them in exactly the right spot." Morrison made his decision. New plan. "We're going to give them something they can't adapt to." "What's that?" Veltar asked. U.S., Morrison said grimly. Johnson, Park, gear up, we're going hunting. The Zentari watched in amazement as the three humans prepared for what could only be described as a suicide mission. They loaded themselves with weapons and explosives, checked their equipment with the casual efficiency of professionals, and prepared to walk directly into the heart of the Vex swarm. This is madness, Veltar protested. You cannot possibly survive a direct assault on their main force. Probably not, Morrison agreed, but that's not the point. The point is to create enough chaos to buy you time. Dr. Park sealed her sample containers and strapped her portable laboratory to her back. The Vex learn by observing and adapting. If we can create enough conflicting data, we can overload their analytical capabilities. Johnson hefted his rifle and grinned. Plus, it's going to be fun watching them try to figure out what hit them. As the three humans prepared to leave the safety of the energy dome, the Vex swarm began to shift again. The adaptation specialists were sending new chemical signals through the ranks, and the chaotic formations were beginning to reorganize. They're learning too fast, Rodriguez warned from her overwatch position. Whatever you're going to do, you need to do it now. Morrison checked his equipment one final time. Veltar, when this is over, you're going to need to request a bigger evacuation fleet. This planet is about to become uninhabitable. Before the Zentari could ask what he meant, the three humans stepped through the energy barrier and disappeared into the darkness beyond. The silence that followed the massive explosion was deafening. Where the main Vex command cluster had stood moments before, there was now only a crater filled with twisted metal and burning biomatter. The shock wave had rippled across the entire swarm, knocking down warriors and collapsing the carefully constructed hive structures that had sprouted across the landscape. Rodriguez watched through her scope as Morrison emerged from the smoke, his armor blackened and torn but his rifle still in his hands. Behind him, Johnson dragged an unconscious Dr. Park away from the blast zone, her portable laboratory sparking with damaged electronics. Holy shit, Rodriguez whispered into her cum. They actually did it. The three humans had walked directly into the heart of the Vex formation, carrying enough explosives to level a city block. They had fought their way through thousands of warriors, leaving a trail of destruction that cut through the swarm like a knife through flesh. When they reached the central command node, they had detonated everything at once. Status report. Morrison's voice came through the calm despite the chaos around him. All primary queens are down, Rodriguez replied. The command structure has completely collapsed. The remaining warriors are attacking everything in sight, including each other. It was true. Without the pheromone guidance of their queens, the Vex had reverted to their most basic programming: kill everything that moves. The once coordinated assault had devolved into a chaotic free-for-all as different castes turned on each other in their confusion. Sullivan's voice joined the conversation from his position beneath the colony. The underground formations are breaking apart. Looks like the loss of command signals is causing a complete behavioral breakdown. Veltar stared at the tactical display in amazement. The organized swarm that had threatened to overrun New Haven was dissolving before his eyes. The Vex warriors wandered aimlessly across the battlefield, their perfect coordination replaced by random violence and self-destruction. This is impossible, he breathed. The Vex have conquered dozens of worlds. They are the perfect biological weapon. No such thing as perfect, Morrison replied as he helped Johnson carry Dr. Park back toward the energy dome. Everything has weaknesses. You just have to be willing to find them. The truth was that the humans had identified something that no other species had ever considered. The Vex were too perfect. Their biological efficiency made them incredibly effective at conquest, but it also made them vulnerable to the kind of chaos that humans specialized in creating. Dr. Park stirred in Johnson's arms. Her glasses cracked, but her mind still sharp. Did we get them all? She asked weakly. Every last queen, Johnson confirmed. Your pheromone analysis was spot on. Once we disrupted their chemical communication network, the whole system fell apart. Rodriguez continued her overwatch from the crystal spire, picking off the occasional Vex warrior that wandered too close to the colony's defenses. But her targets were becoming fewer and farther between as the creatures turned their aggression on each other. "The northern formations are completely gone," she reported. "The survivors are scattered across at least 50 square kilometers. No coordination, no purpose. They're just killing each other now." Sullivan triggered his final set of charges, collapsing the last of the underground tunnel networks. The explosions sent tremors through the ground that could be felt even within the colony's protective dome. "That's it for the tunnel rats," he announced. "They won't be coming up that way again." The humans regrouped at the energy barrier, their mission complete but their work far from over. The immediate threat had been eliminated, but the planet was now littered with scattered Vex warriors who would continue to be dangerous until they were all destroyed. "How long until they reorganize?" Veltar asked hopefully. "They won't, Doctor," Park said, accepting a medical kit from one of the Zentari medics. "We didn't just kill their queens, we broke their entire social structure. These warriors were bred to follow orders, not to think for themselves. Without leadership, they'll eventually die of starvation or exposure." Morrison checked his ammunition and surveyed the battlefield. "The immediate crisis is over, but we still have cleanup to do. There are probably thousands of warriors still alive out there." "Cleanup?" Colvin looked confused. "Hunt them down one by one," Johnson explained with the casual tone of someone discussing routine maintenance. "Can't leave them wandering around where they might hurt someone." The Zentari were beginning to understand that the humans operated by a completely different set of rules than the rest of the galaxy. Where other species would have considered the threat neutralized once the organized assault was broken, the humans were already planning to eliminate every last enemy combatant. "Is that really necessary?" Veltar asked. "They pose no organized threat now." "Tell that to the first colonist who runs into a lost warrior," Morrison replied. "These things are still killing machines, even without leadership. Everyone we leave alive is a potential casualty waiting to happen." Rodriguez's voice crackled through the comm system. "I've got movement in the eastern canyons. Looks like a group of about 50 warriors heading this way. No coordination, just wandering." "I'll take them," Johnson said, checking his weapons. "Could use the exercise after all that sitting around." Dr. Park struggled to her feet, ignoring the protests of the Zentari medics. "I want to study their behavior patterns now that the command structure is gone. This could provide valuable insights into their biology." "Study them from a distance," Morrison warned. "Confused or not, they're still dangerous." Sullivan emerged from the underground tunnels, his uniform covered in dust and debris. "All the charges are spent, but I can rig up some new ones from Colony. Equipment if we need them." The humans began to organize their next phase of operations with the same methodical efficiency they had shown throughout the battle. They divided the surrounding territory into search sectors, established communication protocols, and prepared to spend the next several days hunting down the scattered remnants of the Vex force. "This is how you fight a war," Morrison explained to the fascinated Zentari. "You don't stop when the enemy retreats. You don't stop when they surrender. You stop when every last one of them is no longer a threat." As the twin suns of Kepler 442b began to rise, casting their pale light across the battlefield, the scope of the human victory became clear. The landscape was littered with the remains of what had once been an unstoppable force. The Vex swarm that had conquered dozens of worlds had been destroyed by 5 humans with primitive weapons and an absolute refusal to accept defeat. "Your people are remarkable," Veltar said quietly. "I have never seen anything like this." Morrison smiled grimly as he prepared for the long hunt ahead. "You ain't seen nothing yet?" 3 days later, the massive Galactic defense fleet dropped out of hyperspace above Kepler 442b like a silver armada against the stars. Admiral Zenthara of the Altarian Navy commanded the formation from his flagship, a vessel so large it could house entire cities within its hull. Behind him stretched a line of warships representing every major power in the galaxy, the crystalline cruisers of the Regelians, the biomechanical destroyers of the Arcturians, and the energy-wreathed battleships of a dozen other species. "Scan the planet," Admiral Zenthara ordered his tactical officer. "Prepare for full orbital bombardment if the Vex have established ground positions." The sensor readings that came back made no sense. Where the fleet expected to find a world consumed by Vex corruption, they instead detected the clean energy signatures of New Haven's crystal spires. The colony's defensive grid was powered down, and there were no signs of active combat anywhere on the planet's surface. "Admiral, I'm reading 5 human life signs and approximately 50,000 Zentari survivors," the tactical officer reported, his voice filled with confusion. "No Vex biosignatures detected." "That's impossible," Admiral Zenthara said, his forearms gesturing in disbelief. "Our intelligence indicated a full swarm assault with over 200,000 warriors." "Sir, we're receiving a transmission from the surface." Morrison's voice came through the fleet's communication system with the same casual tone he might use to order coffee. "Galactic Defense Fleet, this is Captain Morrison of the Terra Nova. Nice of you to show up." Admiral Zenthara stared at the communication console as if it had personally insulted him. "Captain Morrison, what is your status? Do you require immediate evacuation?" "Negative on the evacuation. We're just finishing up some cleanup work down here. Should be done in a few hours." "Cleanup work?" The Admiral's voice rose in pitch. "Captain, our sensors indicated a massive Vex infestation on that planet. What happened to the swarm?" "There was a pause before Morrison responded, and when he did, there was something that might have been amusement in his voice. "What swarm?" The fleet sensor operators worked frantically to recheck their readings. They scanned for buried Vex bioforms, hidden hive structures, or any sign of the creatures that had supposedly overrun the planet. They found nothing but scattered debris and the occasional pile of chitinous remains that were already being broken down by the planet's natural bacteria. "Admiral," the lead science officer reported, "I'm detecting trace amounts of Vex biomatter across several hundred square kilometers, but no living specimens. The organic signatures suggest complete cellular breakdown at least 48 hours ago." Admiral Zenthara had commanded fleets for over a century, but he had never encountered a situation like this. In his experience, Vex infestations required months of orbital bombardment followed by years of surface cleansing operations. The idea that 5 beings from a primitive world could eliminate an entire swarm was beyond comprehension. "Captain Morrison, I'm sending down an inspection team to assess the situation." "Copy that, Admiral. Tell them to watch their step. We're still finding the occasional straggler." 2 hours later, the inspection team returned to the flagship with reports that defied every known principle of galactic warfare. The Vex swarm had not just been defeated, it had been systematically dismantled with a precision and brutality that left even veteran soldiers speechless. "Commander, Velanoth of the Rigelian Special?" Forces delivered his report to the assembled fleet commanders with the stunned expression of someone who had witnessed something impossible. "The humans used tactics we've never seen before," he began, his crystalline voice carrying a note of disbelief. "They turned the Vex's own biology against them, exploited weaknesses in their command structure, and fought with a level of aggression that our tactical databases have no classification for." "Explain," Admiral Zenthara demanded. "They used psychological warfare, chemical manipulation, and what can only be described as strategic terrorism. The humans identified that the Vex Queens could experience fear and then systematically terrorized them until their command structure collapsed. The fleet commanders exchanged glances that spoke volumes about their growing concern. The galaxy had always operated under certain rules of engagement: energy weapons, defensive formations, and civilized surrender protocols. The humans had ignored all of these conventions and created their own rules. "There's more," Commander Velanoth continued. "The Zentari colonists have requested that we establish a permanent defense treaty with Earth. They want human advisors to help them develop their own military capabilities." "Military capabilities?" Admiral Zenthara's voice carried horror. "The Zentari are a peaceful species. They've never shown any interest in warfare. They do now. Administrator Veltar specifically mentioned that they want to learn what he called Deathworlder tactics in case they face another Vex incursion. Down on the planet's surface, Morrison stood with his crew on the landing pad where they had first arrived. The Terra Nova sat waiting for them, its small hull looking insignificant compared to the massive fleet overhead. Veltar and a delegation of Zentari had gathered to see them off, their expressions mixing gratitude with something that might have been fear. "We cannot thank you enough for what you have done," Veltar said, his formal words carrying genuine emotion. New Haven owes its existence to your courage and skill. "Just doing our job," Morrison replied, though his team could see the satisfaction in his eyes. They had accomplished something that would be talked about across the galaxy for generations. Dr. Park finished packing her samples of Vex biomatter, her scientific mind already working on the implications of what they had discovered. "I've left detailed tactical analyses with your science division. If you ever face anything like this again, you'll be better prepared." "Will you be returning to this sector?" Colvin asked hopefully. Johnson hefted his gear bag with a grin. "Probably not. Galaxy's a big place, and something tells me there's going to be a lot more calls for human assistance after word of this gets out." He was right. Even as they spoke, the story of New Haven was spreading through the galactic communication networks. 5 humans had accomplished what entire fleets had failed to do. The galaxy was beginning to understand that they had discovered something new, a species that didn't just fight to survive, but fought to win. As the Terra Nova lifted off from the crystal landing pad, Admiral Zenthara watched from his flagship with growing comprehension. The humans hadn't just saved New Haven, they had changed the fundamental balance of power in the galaxy. Every species that faced extinction could now call upon beings who treated the impossible as merely inconvenient. "Sir," his communication officer reported, "we're receiving priority distress calls from 17 different sectors. They're all requesting the same thing. Let me guess," Admiral Zenthara said with resignation. "They want human reinforcements." The communication officer nodded. "Yes, sir. They specifically want Deathworlders." As the Terra Nova disappeared into hyperspace, the Galactic Defense Fleet began the long journey home with the knowledge that warfare in the galaxy would never be the same again. Somewhere out there, 5 humans were already responding to the next impossible mission, carrying with them the casual confidence of apex predators who had found their place among the stars.